Welcome, everybody. Great to have you on the fourth in our series of webinars on the executive order. It's great to have you all here. We're just gathering a bit here. We had a very healthy sign up for this webinar. We're expecting probably over 100 people on the call. So we'll just give it a little bit of a second here. Jim Rosapep's in the house from Maryland. Shonda from Kansas. Randy from ESEPS, representing our early childhood education apprenticeship work. Great to have you, Randy. I only shout out to people who have their names up, so or their videos up. So okay, all right, we've just passed 100. I'm sure we're going to probably have a few more people joining. But I think what I'll do is I'm going to call us to order. I've got just a very little bit of business here. So if I can ask my colleague Denise to put up the slides, that would be great. All right, welcome everybody, and great to have you all with us. As I said, this is the fourth in our series of six field consultations, which we're doing regarding the executive order issued by President Trump around America's workforce development system, and in particular about prioritizing apprenticeship as a key workforce development approach for the country. We're great to have you all here. Today's webinar is going to be a little bit different from our previous three webinars in that we will, as we always do, start with a little bit of background just to make sure everyone's sort of up to date in terms of what we're talking about. But instead of having presentations from guest speakers or from AFA team members, we're going to have a little bit of a fireside chat with leaders from the youth apprenticeship world. That will then, from there, we will segue into a broader conversation with this whole group. Denise, if you want to just flip the slides, that'd be great. And so in order to facilitate all that, we will ask you to do just a couple of things. First off, if you haven't already, please put in the chat your name and organization, just as a way for people to know who all is in the room. Second off, we'll go for about an hour in this webinar, but as with previous webinars, some of us will be hanging out afterwards for a little talk after the webinar. So if you're not keen to be recorded in your comments or want to just talk about what you heard, we'll be hanging out to hear any thoughts that you might have at that stage. Just to facilitate things a little bit, it'll be great if you raise your hand. Use the raise hand feature if you want to speak to the group. And we'll be opening this up for group conversation in just a little bit. But you can always put a thought, comment, question, or idea in the chat, and that's very much appreciated. We definitely mine these chats for content as we're moving forward with our recommendations. And then the last thing I'll just say is that by way of follow-up on this webinar, as always, we will be putting up a recording, and so you'll have a chance to look at the webinar again, or if people who miss it can have a chance to look at it. But importantly, the purpose of these webinars is really to inform Apprenticeships for America as we develop recommendations for the administration on how it might go about implementing a apprenticeship growth strategy. And so we anticipate after the 6-webinar series is over, we'll go a little bit quiet for a couple of weeks while we do some work to synthesize all that we've heard. But we'll be back towards the end of June with a webinar that will focus on presenting at least a draft of our recommendations, and then we'll be presenting those to the administration shortly thereafter. I think with that, I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Harry Leach, who's just going to give us a little background, and then we'll go to our fireside chat. Harry.
Great. Thanks, John. I'm going to quickly talk us through what it says in the executive orders on youth and touch on why we think youth is such a big part of the expansion question. And then we're going to bring in some of our friends from CareerWise and PAYA to give their views on the state of play and what we need to think about on growing youth apprenticeships. So, firstly, on what the executive orders say. So, up front, there's not a particularly explicit focus on youth. We don't think that's an admission. You know, the executive orders are very high level. It's a page. What they do say is two things that touch on youth. Firstly, we've got some wording in this section in the executive order that's calling for a kind of wider report on redeploying workforce funding that talks about identifying alternate credentials to degrees that can be mapped to specific skill needs of prospective employers. In our thinking, that is apprenticeships. You know, almost by definition, apprenticeships are mapped to skills needs. In terms of positioning this, we wouldn't necessarily put apprenticeships as a direct alternative to degrees here. You know, you can do an apprenticeship that gets you a degree. But there's definitely some thinking and some points we can make on that. And then the second reference in the report the administration is asking for on expanding apprenticeships, DOL and the other agencies are asked to consider opportunities to enhance the link between education and apprenticeships, specifically on funding. So we talked about this in the interplay a few weeks ago. So it's fairly high level, but we definitely think this gives us a window to make suggestions and come up with creative ideas on expanding youth apprenticeships. So I wanted to just talk through, you know, a bit more macro why we think youth is such an important part of the expansion story. So just going to the next slide. So we're recycling this from an earlier session that we did, but so this is a hypothecation of how you could get to 1 million active apprentices, where those new apprentices could come from. The purple bar here shows what the numbers could look like if just 2% of our high school cohort that's graduating high school went into apprenticeships after graduating. That would mean around 75,000 more active apprenticeships. So even that 2% could be a pretty significant contributor to the administration's overall goal. So looking at the next slide. So that 2% is actually a pretty conservative estimate of what could happen based on the experience of other countries. And we think the potential for youth apprenticeships is huge. So there's a few points to pull out here. Firstly, if you look at the destinations of a typical high school cohort, so that's about 3.7 million people graduating each year. Our estimate is around 0.5% of those, just under 0.5%, are taking apprenticeships in a few years after graduating apprenticeships. So that's around 15,000. Internationally, the countries that have got really scaled up, developed apprenticeship systems are far, far higher. So Germany with the dual education system is at 56%. So 56% of their high school graduates are going into apprenticeships. Switzerland is even higher. I think it's around 70%. Other countries, perhaps like slightly more similar to the US in labour market terms, England, Australia is lower than that, but still pretty significant. England's quite interesting. There's been a drop off recently in young people taking apprenticeships. Apprentices are starting to trend a bit older, and there's quite a lot of policy change, rejigging funding to try and rebalance back towards youth. So thinking about potential scale in the long run, beyond the 1 million active apprentices that we're talking about at the moment, if we had a similar proportion to Germany, you know, just over 50% of the cohort were going into apprenticeships, that would be, you know, around 2 million new apprentices a year. That's the flow, not the stock. So new apprentices, not active. So, if we did have a system similar to Germany with youth, we'd be looking at around 4 million active apprentices overall coming from youth alone. So the point here is if we care about the expansion of apprenticeships, we need to care about youth and how the system works for young people. And it's equally true the other way around. If we care about good outcomes for young people, we care about youth apprenticeships. Great. So I'm now gonna bring in some of our friends and experts who know a lot more than we do about the specifics of youth. So we've got Erica Simon from Partnership to Advanced Youth Apprenticeships. Hi, Erica. And do we have Brent yet, or maybe someone else from CareerWise?
Hey, I'm not
Oh,
ready.
hey. Brilliant. Thanks, Brent. Great. So I'm going to kick us off with a couple of questions to get the discussion started, but please everyone else, start putting your hand up if you've got comments to make or questions or want to add to the conversation. Denise, do you mind putting the slide down and seeing if we can spotlight the speaker? So I want to kick us off. We've given a bit of a sense of why we think youth apprenticeships are a big part of this question. We're looking at the administration's current focus, why youth is important to a scaled system. But I'd like to take a step back and just start with the real basics, the current state of play. And just start with the question, what is youth apprenticeship? What are we talking about? What's the value proposition here? Can I start with you, Erica?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here today. So, youth apprenticeship it's a strategy for creating an inclusive economy, but rather than, starting after high school, post-secondary, when a lot of apprenticeship starts, we really focus on youth apprenticeships starting in high school, where there's an opportunity for students to begin their awareness and exploration of careers and occupations while they're still in high school, and it provides an opportunity for them to have some on-the-job learning with the related technical instruction, and ultimately gives them an opportunity to earn an industry-based credential and some post-secondary credits. And we think that's really valuable for getting younger students on the right track to what the labor market information tells us are in demand, high need, good paying jobs. So in a nutshell, it's following the tenets of registered apprenticeship with all those principles of learning on the job and earning while you learn, and growing your skills while just doing it a little earlier.
Brilliant. Thanks, Erica. Brent, over to you. Why do we care about youth apprenticeship so much?
Fully endorse everything Erica just said, and I will just add, in the context of the broader field, but also even the executive order, I think that I think there's something uniquely powerful about youth apprenticeship that, again, as Erica described, as PAYA defines, it's something that seamlessly engages someone while still in school to enter into the apprenticeship opportunity, starting the apprenticeship before they actually graduate. I think the field is also tangling with the question, though, also of there's a difference between youth in apprenticeship versus a youth apprenticeship model. And very much what Erica described in PAYA and I deeply believe has a unique value add of a purposefully designed apprenticeship program that connects with education in this youth model. I think the EO speaks also to a broader universe of how to connect more young people into apprenticeship programs, even if those programs do start after high school. I think it's important for us as an activated community to kind of see value across those ends. There's different types of industry sectors, predominantly the building trades, where some of those apprenticeships will not start until someone's 18 or can start after high school. But that does not mean it should be disconnected from our education systems. And so I think holistically, when you're at a country, you're looking at the value out of apprenticeship, it is about this very seamless preparation infrastructure, transition infrastructure into an apprenticeship model. And I think the value add of whether it's a true blue youth apprenticeship or a pathway into apprenticeship for young people, there's very clear value propositions in terms of the the average age of an apprentice being 28 in the United States. That's almost a decade of lost earnings. If you consider if those are working learners, if those are folks that have, low wage jobs where they're trying to go to school, an apprenticeship can really bump that earnings boost earlier in life. That's why you always hear the stories of youth apprentices buying houses. There's not a lot of 25-year-olds that buy houses. A lot of that shows about the wealth building around apprenticeship and that kind of decade of lost earnings that I think apprenticeship turns on its face. From the employer perspective, when you're partnering with schools and your apprenticeship model, there's more infrastructure to leverage to improve your return on investment, whether that's foundational coursework that can happen through the career technical education system, whether that's some of the intermediary roles that schools can take on, the preparation, the readiness that's associated with apprenticeship programs. There's built-in infrastructure to leverage in education systems that reduces the upfront investment that employers have to make in an apprenticeship program. And I'll just end by saying, the idea that we should be using this apprenticeship for engaging a rising generation of young people into a range of workforces, whether it's ones that are being transformed by technology or ones with raw need, is just the right thing to do in terms of how industry is going to need to meet talent needs. You can't sit back and wait, but also young people can't be what they can't see is what they always say. And the idea for being able to motivate, excite, and engage young people much earlier on and provide them that what is that other option after high school, apprenticeship should really be stepping into that void to fill in the blanks.
Completely agree. Thanks, Brent. I think you mentioned earlier, we're talking about different models within a wider apprenticeship ecosystem here. I want to talk a bit about what's going on at the moment. You both work with programs across the country. Where is this youth apprenticeship model working well? What's the effective model? What's the framework that makes it work?
Brent, you want to start talking about Colorado? It seems like it's a prime example to kick off with.
Yeah, I think its states are really key in the effort for really kind of shaping how apprenticeship and connections to youth fits in within their respective contexts. If you look in a state like Colorado or New York, I think Colorado is really trying to bring a holistic view to the idea of kind of how we get more young people into apprenticeship programs. Obviously, the organization I now part of, CareerWise, is a big partner in Colorado in terms of building youth apprenticeship pathways that start in high schools. That is something that's valued and recognized within the state kind of ecosystem and infrastructure within the registered system in Colorado. And at the same time, they're building really strong networks of intermediaries and community-based organizations that can be supporting youth that might be out of school into apprenticeship opportunities as well. I think states that take this kind of unified view of how they want to handle this, but recognize that there are both policy issues in terms of definition and how you measure things and what they work, but also how you choose to resource them. Not looking at these as individually siloed spaces is something that's really important. Either way, where we're also working in New York, youth apprenticeship is registered. We are building towards pathways that are recognized by the state. They're about working closely with our employers to create multi-employer programs, so not every business has to start from scratch. But there has a clear crafted space, for example, in the New York City public school system for what entering into this pathway looks like, both in terms of preparatory work, in terms of readiness, in terms of when to apply in your high school experience and when not to. I think that's a really kind of understated important aspect of how you deal with this is how you get apprenticeship on the school cycle. So it's not seen as something off on the side. That work we see playing out where apprenticeship is taking its own space in different states that are kind of defining it in their own apprenticeship context, but it's not changing what we ask of employers, what we ask of schools, and what we ask of apprentices to commit to. And I think that's one of the most important takeaways for us, whether it's Colorado with small, medium-sized manufacturers or New York City with large Fortune 100 financial firms. It's the same core principles of what this program plays out, leveraging the quality indicators of the system and the right ecosystems of partners to make it happen.
Yeah, I would just second all of that. And, you know, and I see in the chat, there's a lot of discussion around, you know, definitions, and, you know, that there are some in some states, but we know there's not a federal definition for youth apprenticeship. And but to Brent's point, you know, states are you know, getting at youth apprenticeship in different ways, or apprenticeships for youth in different ways, and but all with the, you know, same goal in mind, which is getting young people you know, started early and engaged in meaningful skill building jobs. So you know, I mean, North Carolina definitely is leading the way with youth apprenticeship, Indiana as well. So I mean, there are definitely highlighted pockets around the country, and don't mean to omit anyone who's doing good work, because there are lots of folks doing good work in this space out there.
Just to expand on that a bit, Erica, and pick up a question from the chat a bit more. Do we need a federal definition of youth apprenticeship, or are we better off being a bit more flexible?
You know, it's a good question. I mean, given that the way the executive order is kind of laying out, and potential budget is laying out, that you know, maybe funds are going to be coming down to the states via block grants. You know, I'm not sure if it would add more confusion to states that already have clear and you know, clear processes for and, you know, and their own ways that they're defining youth apprenticeships. So you know, I don't necessarily think that we have to have a federal definition. It might cause more confusion, but you know, I think there are lots of different ways to think about it.
Yeah, I think there's a nuanced but important difference between federal recognition and federal definition. And when you think of the role that I think everybody's looking for the states to kind of lead on strategies with an apprenticeship, whether that's at the federal government or how the Hill continues to put dollars towards states in the apprenticeship system. I think that you just looking across the country right now, there's still space to get to some more kind of normative about what's more better norms about what's working in the field. But I think there's value, and this just goes to where we're at federally in apprenticeship broadly, is we're operating obviously in a world of regulations, not legislation. And so there you have funding streams disconnected with structures around how we are choosing to support the expansion of apprenticeships and what role policy plays in it. I think sending strong messages that you want to see better connections between apprenticeship and education, really important to really kind of see how states can experiment and kind of push the limits on that front. I see the value of having more young people have opportunities to apprenticeship sooner in life is something that not only serves employers better, but actually more importantly serves in many cases youth better in terms of finding their way on their journey. I think that recognition also calls in effect who's involved with what. And I think it does start to piece apart some of the stuff that's in the chat of what's the difference between a pre-apprenticeship, for example, or a youth apprenticeship program. I think those are important things to parse out and recognize. There's not a federally recognized definition for pre-apprenticeship right now. And so there's a broad universe of things that fall in that category. I do think calling out the fact that you want to have more young people in apprenticeship, that there's a role to play, how states can kind of better link and connect their education and apprenticeship systems to give them space to experiment in how they do that, but at the same time recognize that apprenticeship means something and that we have some core principles about what that should mean is something that I think right now, I know federally, the federal government is trying to look at what the states are doing on this front and what role they should play or not in that space.
That's a great point. I'm going to open up the discussion soon, so please put your hands up and we'll bring you in. Before we do, I just want to turn to scale and the question we're here to talk about. How do we get to 1 million active apprenticeships? So thinking about scale and youth, what's holding us back right now? Why do we only have 0.5% of a high school graduate going into apprenticeship at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, there are I think challenges with our messaging around apprenticeships and sort of an old model of, what a apprenticeable occupation looks like. And I think that sort of improving our messaging around it is one way. And then, I think, it's what we're talking about here, starting young to be able, you put up that graph in the very beginning, Harry, about, showing just 0.2% increase in youth apprentices makes a significant difference in getting to that 1 million apprentices, that's laid out in the executive order. But I mean, there's a lot of tools in the toolbox to get folks on board. I mean, we need to have employers at the beginning of these conversations to recognize the value and buy in and understand the return on investment for them, and sort of creating talent pipelines. And that's something that can happen when you start with students that are a little bit younger. And and then, I mean, in increasingly seeing policy at the state level, which is endorsing, having young people start. And, I think, we talk about, sort of pay per apprentices or tax credits. I mean, there's a lot of tools that can be instituted to sort of improve the uptake of, not only schools and post-secondary and intermediaries getting involved in helping build out programs, but the policymakers as well. So, there's work being done at the state level to improve policy, and there's lots of ways to get there, but it's hard work. If it was easy, we'd see a lot more youth apprentices.
I would say policy can focus on some of the system levers, and I wouldn't create a world of new employer incentives or tax incentives just for youth apprenticeships versus non-youth apprenticeships. And I would say there's a broader conversation that I'm sure we'll host at some point, or maybe I missed, it's already happened, around what are the different incentive structures for how you get the demand side worked up. But I do think there's a lot of devil in the details, but if we try to figure those out for all sectors at once, we're going to get overwhelmed. And when I think of even like in the world of where we want more young people to go into apprenticeships, what works in the manufacturing sector versus the trades versus, say, healthcare can look very different in terms of how these structures come together to get more youth into these programs. What doesn't change is that it would be a great world, and I think there's great public openness, more so than the past 10 years, I would say, for what it means to be kind of apprenticeship ready coming out of high school. What is the role of schools and what's not? To not have them be another hand at the door, knocking on the doors of employers or trying to start up new apprenticeship infrastructure, but how are they leveraging career and technical education coursework, for example, for pre-apprenticeship or related instruction? How are they looking at flexible scheduling? How are they looking at issues around career navigation and college planning and making sure apprenticeships integrate on the front end? So I think policy at the federal and state level can help define some of those roles. I see Chris out in the chat talking about North Carolina. I think North Carolina has tackled some of the connections with the community colleges. A lot of people don't understand is that youth apprenticeship programs are often, they're post-secondary programs, but they map into high schools. So community colleges can play a big role in that space. But how are you looking at how apprenticeships, for example, in the trades can be partnering with high schools as part of kind of a community benefits agreement, for example? So like there's some things that have to be handled sector by sector. I think policy can play a big role in these more non-traditional fields, how you get more employers at the table, how you better define the roles of schools and colleges, and how you leverage existing kind of workforce funding streams to support a more high impact model like apprenticeship versus what they typically support.
Thanks, both. Lots of great points there that we should come back to. How do we integrate with K-12? What's the role of community colleges and the funding system? One last question for me, and then I'll bring people in. We've talked quite a lot about the need for flexibility and the state role, but just thinking about the executive orders specifically, what role would you like this administration to play in solving those policy problems, removing those barriers?
I mean, this is not any sort of genius point here, but we need more funding. We need more funding from the federal government. I mean, I saw a story this morning that there's going to be a siphoning off from Harvard into trade schools, but it's not a rob Peter to pay Paul. It's that there just needs to be a much more robust investment across the workforce system to get to these kinds of numbers. So that would be the place to start. That may be taking a sort of pie in the sky approach, but that's the reality.
I'll do a safer thing and remark from my own experience at, within the department and say, I don't think we need another regulatory effort. I think push Congress to do its job and create a modernized National Apprenticeship Act that links funding, strategy, and policy that takes into account kind of how the field has changed since 1937 or even 1987. We got to get out of the pendulum swing of regulation, whether that's IRAPs, whether that's kind of more comprehensive issues. Let's work with Congress and actually any administration, whether I was Trump 1 or where I was, is going to have inherently limited in what it can and can't do to really usher in change that's needed, but also protect what needs to be protected within the apprenticeship system. We should be working with Congress for a reauthorized National Apprenticeship Act and deal some of these issues around youth, et cetera, and how funding relates to them through legislation, not regulation. I think to the extent of what the administration can do now is, and it's funny, Chris, you just dropped this in. I think one of the things I'm most proud of that we got to work on was trying to move from state competitions to state formula, something that looked a lot more like state formula funding to create more predictable, sustainable funding for states to build capacity and infrastructure in a reasonable way over time, to both continue to innovate, but also resource the system and the connections it needs to build across workforce education and economic development. And so as they look to using appropriations for dollars, I think making the resources more predictable, sustainable, and integrated with how we see our apprenticeship system functioning across states, I think is really important. At the same time, I think there's experimentation that continue. I think running grant competitions has limited benefits, to be quite frank, around how to do it. But I think intermediaries and innovations play an important role. And I think that putting resources towards that innovation is certainly continuing to be needed. But I think policy strategy wise, we need a National Apprenticeship Act to take the system to the next level.
Great points. And Chris has put it very succinctly in the sidebar: more funding, consistent funding, predictable funding. I think maybe that can be the majority of our submission to the administration on this.
Unless anybody pass apprenticeship Pell anytime soon, I think you're going to miss the short-term Pell train. But we'll see if anybody has thoughts on that.
I'm going to start bringing people in, so please put your hand up if you've got a comment or a question. Let's start with you, Jim.
Thank you very, very much. And good to see everybody, and thanks for your engagement in all this. This is great. I'm going to take a little bit of a mole's eye view from Maryland in terms of models for what we call youth apprenticeship. And I just want to put a headline on it. What we're doing in Maryland, we're moving away from what I call segregated youth apprenticeship, where you have a separate program for kids who are in high school. We're moving towards the high school level of a registered apprenticeship. And it just means it's a registered apprenticeship. It's a real registered apprenticeship. It just starts in high school instead of after high school. That's our plan. That's in state law. That's in state funding. That's where we're moving our school systems to convert CTE into the RTI. And I want to double down on one of the things Brent said about that in terms of who can do what. And I think this is where the executive order might play a role, or the administration or legislation, federal activity could, is moving the CTE system broadly into being RTI, the high school level registered apprenticeships, would be a big deal because the money is already there. And I'm not talking about Perkins money. I'm just talking about the state and local money. That's where most of the money for CTE comes from. And most of it is not used for RTI. And it's there. We don't need new money to do that. We're spending the money right now. We just need to reorient it towards being RTI. Second thing, and again, maybe this is something that they could do through executive orders, because the president seems to like executive orders, is tell the school systems they got to blow up their schedules. that it cannot be the case that a 16 and 17-year-old high school student has to show up for 6 hours a day, 5 days a week for no apparent reason. That would be huge in terms of opening up employer demand. And finally, and this would be a question for probably for federal law, but it's related to this, is some states bar age discrimination against people under 18. Maryland is one that does. The federal law does not. And so one thing I think we could do to really help high school level apprenticeships is amend the federal age discrimination law, which right now only applies to people over 40, to apply to people under 18. Just some thoughts.
Thanks, Jim. Those are interesting suggestions. You got some support in the sidebar for those. Todd, do you want to come in?
Yes, thank you. And I couldn't agree more with the senator. The state of Connecticut does have a model quite specifically like that. We are huge proponents of contextualization of CTE. Like, y'all got rid of shops in middle schools and high schools decades ago. And I think we do need to bifurcate funding versus program. We're program first. We've been around up till 12 years ago. There wasn't a dime for apprenticeship on a federal level, not a dime. That being said, we've been sustaining for decades. Yes, it's an older model. There's no question about it. I do agree with Brett on one thing. We should need to deregulate a few things. When I was a member of the ACA, we didn't have complete consensus of NASDAQ, but we do have a general consensus that there should be a pre-apprenticeship and an apprenticeship. That's it. This entire thing about youth or people that are different biographics, different veterans, pre-apprenticeship, so on and so forth, should be pre-apprenticeship or apprenticeship. Youth apprenticeship would be a focus of pre-apprenticeship. It's getting too convoluted, way too much. That being said, I do agree career tech ed or STEM education has no occupational focus. I think education has some work to do there. I do agree. And with regard to opening up Pell, yeah, I think it has been extremely punitive to individuals that want to go into occupational certification type of post-secondary to be able to afford a loan to go to a type of school. There definitely needs that will open up a lot. But that's again, I think more of a focus on pre-apprenticeship and just deem it youth pre-apprenticeship. Due to the fact that, I agree with the senator, the high school or adult education for that matter, get that RTI out of the way, front load it. That's what the focus should be. And again, when you're asking schools to do work-based learning through pre-apprenticeship for the world of work or a part-time apprenticeship, they don't even have a work-based release policy. So again, that block scheduling is just ridiculously cumbersome, and it gets in the way of actually being able to do this because they don't even have the ability to actually let these kids out of school. Thank you.
I just can respond, Todd, good to see you. Senator, good to see you. Three things that between those two comments that I think raises is, to some extent, apprenticeships on the outside of looking in of three really hard issues when actually it's the right solve for them, which is one, even on school time and release time. Apprenticeship is at its essence, yeah, it's burdensome to register a program. That's because, though, in many respects, it's a labor standard for a protected workplace. That should be, if a young person is in a registered apprenticeship environment, or Todd, I would say, if it's a pre-apprenticeship with a strong articulation, sure, although I would lean towards why not let them do some of the OJT if it's occupational specific at that age, then the registered apprenticeship actually has standards in place that should allow for school release time to participate in a safe, appropriate working environment. Paid. I think that apprenticeship is an unlock for some of those issues that other forms of work-based learning have struggled to unlock, or let's just say state policies trying to guard against. Number two, on things like Pell with appropriate certifications and industry certifications, for example, of or what's of value, we've spent a lot of time and resources trying to assess a credential of value at the state and federal level over the past several years. How they're embedded into apprenticeships, where they're already aligned, helps deal with some of those issues. But the last piece, just around, I would say, how a young person is preparing for a particular type of opportunity and what the clear kind of line of sight is between your 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th, 12th, 12th grade, whether it's pre-apprenticeship, apprenticeship readiness, and starting a full-blown registered youth apprenticeship program, which I'd say is where most states have moved towards instead of an independent one. Indiana, of course, being the outlier who's trying to experiment in that space, following kind of now Wisconsin's created the independent structure. is that there's clarity of role of what happens 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th as a true pathway and scaffolding, whether someone goes into the apprenticeship or not. That has thought through much more than like a 6-week pre-apprenticeship implemented the last semester of senior year. We've got to get out of that mentality that that's enough to prepare. We all know it's not in terms of how a young person makes their decisions.
Great points. I want to come to you, Randy, next. I think you're having some trouble putting your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Harry. And I want to just echo everything that Todd said. Until the high schools are set up to let kids spend some of their time outside of the classroom, we're never going to solve this issue of tracking 2,000 hours in a reasonable amount of time. But that's not my question. My question today, I think there's a reckoning that needs to happen at the apprenticeship system because we're putting out little talking points that don't line up with reality. And that what I want to raise is bigger than just youth apprenticeship, but it certainly impacts youth apprenticeship. And that is, I cut and pasted from the first slide that Harry showed. And one of the bullets said, strategies to identify alternative credentials and assessments to the 4-year college degree that can be mapped to the specific skill needs of prospective employers. Having worked for 10 years as a university professor in a college of education, and then for 10 years in the apprenticeship system, focused not only on early education, but also watching what's going on in K-12. There is no way right now that the universities are going to give up their power and their control of the path to teacher certification to where we could actually set up a parallel system of alternative credentials and assessments and prove that they are of equal quality. It becomes an issue of the teacher unions. It also becomes an issue of the universities. I'm going to be really frank, the university's arrogance that think that the only ones who could ever appropriately prepare a new teacher would be a university, and how could you even suggest otherwise? And so I think there are enormous challenges in this whole, and I don't think it's limited to education. I think healthcare is going to hit the same roadblock, and there's probably other sectors where the universities have a hold on this, and nobody is really going to rethink that to the point of it being an alternative pathway. And so right now, when an apprentice finishes an apprenticeship in education or early childhood education, the certificate you get from apprenticeship truly is kind of meaningless, because if you don't get state certification, you can't get a job. And that state certification is still tied to the university system. So there's a question in there. There's a lot of commentary, I acknowledge, but there's also a question in there about what do we do to make this statement meaningful, that there needs to be alternative credentials to 4-year college degrees.
I mean, you bring up a lot of good points, and I mean, certainly having worked on the ground both in sort of supporting healthcare and education apprenticeships and youth apprenticeships. I mean, it is true that universities have what they like to think is a lock on getting students ready for the workforce, but the demand is so high that there are alternatives, and that's where I would bring in employers. I mean, I've seen great examples of healthcare employers recognizing that they need to be at the table from the beginning, talking to community colleges and other training providers to make sure that the students that are being trained are being trained well for those jobs. And you see it in the community colleges. I mean, they're community college bachelor's degrees. And so, maybe there's not a big distinction between what you're suggesting in terms of schools of education at 4-year universities. But I think, I think there are creative ways that in pockets out there that are getting students trained for these in-demand jobs. And I'm thinking specifically of healthcare and education. And we just have to be amenable to some level of creativity to get there.
you use the word reckoning, Randy, up front. And so I'll just say I think that I think Eric is right about kind of the evolutionary approach to this, but the reckoning in some ways that the field is deal with is, do you mow down the path of understanding that accredited colleges and universities still hold the coin of the realm in terms of credit and march toward academic degrees, transferable degrees? And so do you align apprenticeship with those, or do you try to build something of equal, or one would even say maybe greater value? That's a different type of degree or diploma. And if that's the kind of reckoning you're dealing with, I think that what you're seeing is that definitely the work is happening somewhere in between those spaces. And I think one of the issues that you always have, particularly if this conversation is about youth apprenticeship, is that one of the challenges has been that young people have often seen, or at least the country has seen, as apprenticeship is deterministic, for that's the career for life. The integration of college degrees opens up this possibility that you can be an apprentice, you can have a great job and a career in a field, but you maybe want to move from manufacturing technician into engineering at some point, and you're not being set back or punished for that. Recognizing that apprenticeship is not necessarily maybe the through line all the way to engineering, for example, yet, then it would make sense to have a high level of integration with in whatever degree you're earning through your apprenticeship as a technician is something that could be transferable to go on to become an engineer one day if you wanted to. On the other hand, I think you see a lot of great work happening to try to build apprenticeship degrees. So, in other words, you're doing the hard work of actually not just trying to get college to recognize the learning in an apprenticeship, but co-design degrees. And for example, I know NCAT has been out there that we've worked with, but also our partners at Colorado Mountain College of doing that in the teaching profession. I will just say this. There seems to be another big space for how you are also not putting industry and faculty at odds with each other in terms of these types of issues, because that's often where the bump is hitting, is that getting what the competencies our business wants through apprenticeship or industry wants through apprenticeship fully approved, and that assessment is happening in a neutral environment, that the colleges and the faculty are willing to accept it. It feels to me we should have a breakthrough in this country around accreditation. Like, how does apprenticeship and industry sponsors serve a better role in accrediting certain types of degrees that could be happening through a true design, earn, and learn model that takes some of that risk down for college partners, because they're using like a specialized apprenticeship accreditor, for example, for their degree program. It feels to me that using the best of apprenticeship is industry driven, but still using the kind of pathway potential and mainstream potential of what it means to continue a career in college should be something we should be able to figure out. I think you're right. There's a reckoning of sort of which directions to push on first. I still feel there's some greenfield space to be looking at kind of industry driven accreditation and recognition. Unfortunately, I think that goes with scale too, in terms of who are the big industry partners that are really to lean in on that work to really kind of make apprenticeship transformative, which we're still playing uphill on.
Thanks. I'm going to put in the chat box. We were actually at this coming out in the fall is the 4th edition of the the Handbook on Research in Teacher Education. And we were asked to write the chapter on apprenticeship. And it is not focused on ECE, it's focused on K-12. I'm going to put, just for anyone who's interested, a link to the article that will be coming out in the fall that will just add to, the kind of highlighting the kind of issues, Brent, that you're raising.
Thanks, Randy.
Thanks, Randy. And I just want to highlight something you said earlier, Randy, on licensing and licensed professions, where I think we are starting to see some solutions at the states that have legislated to align apprenticeship and license requirements, made that process automatic. So there's room to go further on that. Can I bring in Ed next, please? That's Ed Gooding. You might be on mute. Cool. We'll come back to you, Ed, if you still have a question. But can I go to Katrina?
I am Katrina Gray. I am the apprenticeship director for Central Community College in Nebraska. And so we do ours a little bit different with high schools. We actually have high schools as our hubs. and we have them own the registered apprenticeship program, and we help them be successful with inside of their registered apprenticeship program by identifying an apprenticeship professional that can help those youth apprenticeships be successful. Also, we have like programs for career exploration. Ours is considered JAG. It might be called something else in other places, but we utilize that as our career exploration as our pre-apprentices. So any companies that are connected with the college registered apprenticeship and or the high school, then those companies, and then they have an apprentice, and those companies get to be a part of the JAG. They get to go in and they talk about their occupations, their jobs, whatever they have, because they have apprentices. So we utilize an ecosystem and we create the ecosystem for the community. So if something were to happen to the community college and we were defunded, the ecosystem without the community college, the high schools would have their own registered apprenticeship going while the community is involved, and for whatever reason we hope we are not defunded, but and then we use our youth. So we use that child labor law that we have for apprenticeships, and that's one of the things that I see is very beneficial for us. That's opened up the doors for so many manufacturings, because a lot of 18-year-olds can't even mow the yard that's on the property. So we just say, hey, take this labor law and give it to your insurance, let us know what you think, and usually they come back and they open it. But when we have our work processing schedule, we have work processing schedule. Blue is only what 16-year-olds can do while they're on the job. Yellow is only what 17-year-olds can do while they're on the job, and when they're 18 they can do it all. And so we do start ours at 16 depending, but we also have it set up in the high school. We utilize the dual credit that's already there. They start the apprenticeship program as a junior, and they don't start working until their end of their junior year, and then they start in the summertime. The one thing that we have found that makes it really hard for the schools is they're so stuck on that 2,000 hours. The students getting that 2,000 hours. So if we could get that 2,000 hours and do competencies and and making them proficient at those tasks, those 16-year-old tasks, those 17-year-old tasks, and 18, and they only have half of a work processing schedule. And then when they move into the adult apprenticeship program, then they finish the remaining rest at Central Community College if they transition into the community college, and then they finish the rest of it. So you really just have to like dig deep in who owns it and how do you get them to create it, and it's working so far in our area, but that 2,000 hours is what's killing us, and we're okay with front loading, but the 2,000 hours, I don't know why nobody can get past that one. So, but just wanted to share just, different ways of being able to do it. And we are able to connect with our universities in ways, but not all of them either. It just really depends who is the chair or who is the president of those colleges as well. And if they believe in apprenticeships. Thank you.
Thanks, Katrina, for sharing that. That's a really interesting model and food for thought. We've only got a few minutes left, so we'll take a few more questions and comments. David, can I come to you next?
Thank you all so much. Wonderful conversation. I greatly appreciate it. As a state that has a pretty, we'll use unique execution of youth apprenticeship, but I would say equally successful to any other state in the country. I love the conversation on coursework for youth and apprenticeship and accreditation. And it's because as we move more into the direction of degree attaining registered apprenticeships, the coursework becomes more heavy. And as it stands right now in Wisconsin, and I think across the country, it's not unalike, is that young people that even take coursework via dual enrollment toward a degree attaining registered apprenticeship don't get high school credit. So that coursework where they could take a math course that would count toward their registered apprenticeship doesn't count toward the minimum math requirement for them to graduate high school. And that's absurd. When we start to talk about the bifurcated system, separate of workforce where apprenticeship sits in academia, where these degree attaining registered apprenticeships sit. In my very humble opinion, it becomes a bit of a cash grab for tuition, because there's no good reason that a young person that would go through work processes, or even a registered apprenticeship for that matter, could not. I'll use the word gain credit for their work experiences or life experiences toward that degree attaining registered apprenticeship. So when all of those systems are able to come together, and that may be something good with the latest of executive orders, to merge those systems together, where individuals can get work credit and course credit toward that degree attaining registered apprenticeship. I'll say, at least for us, it'll skyrocket our participation in teacher apprenticeship, because there's still a lock down of those specific degree attaining coursework that would then roll into that youth apprenticeship or registered apprenticeship for that matter.
It's a great point, and I'll just say on the credit for on-the-job training or work-based learning is a huge unlock. There's not a business model for it in higher ed right now. And that's, to my friends and family here from higher ed or community colleges, like, that's just the truth. Outside of customized training programming, which happens largely on the non-credit side of the house, we have, at a policy level, I think you're absolutely right, David, like, where are things that can be experimented at the state or the federal level to engage and have a conversation about, if we're going to provide resources to cover post-secondary related instruction costs associated with apprenticeship, how are you not completely segregating RTI from credit to earn through on-the-job training or work-based learning? In fact, you're rewarding it for institutions that design degrees and programs to provide credit for where credit's due. And I think we all know, when you're learning against a structured training program, on-the-job learning can be as valuable, and so it should be recognized.
Thanks, both. Some important points there. I just want to highlight something in the sidebar. Shonda, can I bring you in for the last word, just to briefly explain what this insurance issue is and whether it's something we need to address?
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so there's been a lot of conversation around the insurability of 16 and 17-year-olds, specifically in hazardous occupation areas. The federal law is very explicit and clear on what hazardous occupation HOs that specifically youth registered apprentices are legally able to do. What happens, though, is that there still becomes a misnomer, especially with insurance companies and workers' compensation companies, basically stating, because it's easier to state, that it's illegal. We cannot have anyone under the age of 18 on this job site because it's illegal. It's not illegal. It's actually perfectly legal. It's a business decision by the insurance compensation, workers' compensation carriers. My suggestion, the state of Kansas, and I know a couple other states, I think Maryland is one of them. Missouri has a letter as well from a specific insurance provider. I'm pulling it up right now. But we've clarified this for the state of Kansas. Ultimately, at least for the state of Kansas, as well as several other states, they follow the National Council on Compensation Insurance and the Classification Manual and Rules Manual. I don't know if there's been any sort of federal level outreach to this organization to sit down and have a real conversation around the value proposition of registered apprenticeships for 16 and 17-year-olds. And I would highly suggest that I feel like Apprenticeship for America would be a great place for that to happen. I don't know if CareerWise, if you've had any conversations with them. You have. I think we've reached out to them before, but we've not gotten anywhere with it because it's a very layered system. The other thing is that I would also just encourage to say that the 2,000-hour minimum requirement, that doesn't have to happen in 12 months period. It can be done over several years. So I just don't want confusion to happen there. And I think that's why there's this push to create a youth registered apprenticeship definition. I'll stop there. Thank you, Harry.
Thanks, Shonda. It sounds like there's definitely some clarification we should get involved in there. We're at time, so thank you everyone for your participation and comments and questions. Especially thanks to Brent and Erica. I'm going to pass back to John to close us out.
Great, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. Great to have you with us and great to stay on for the whole session. Really appreciate it. Stay tuned for 2 more sessions next week's on AI. And the week that follows is, oh, help me out, Harry. States, the states.
States.
How could I'm looking at all my states in front of me. It's great. Looking forward to collecting feedback and ideas from those sessions. Please do feel free to participate. Anyone who wants to hang out and chat a little bit afterwards, Harry and I and others will be here and look forward to getting off the cuff or off the record comments. And otherwise, also look for our other webinars. They're on our website, apprenticeshipsforamerica.org. Look at the events tab. Lots of stuff going on. Great to see everyone. Have a great rest of your day.